Welcome all to the second panel of noise fields titled Architectures of Amplification, Difference, Listening and Space. I'm Rohit Mazumdar. I teach at the School of Environment and Architecture. Following this previous panel that engaged in conversations about the relationship between urban densities, noise and freedom, in this panel, we ask, how does the cultural framing of urban sound into noise shape and get shaped by architectures of amplification? We pose this question in the backdrop of ongoing socioeconomic changes in urban regions across the world. Consider, for instance, the case of Mumbai, which has shown a sharp increase in the rise of Hindi-speaking residents between the 2001 and the 2011 census. Mumbai city showed a 39% increase in this linguistic group during this decade, whereas the rise in the same group was as high as 87% in the peripheries that constitute its metropolitan region. The profile of the proliferation of textile mills during the early 20th century led to a major migration, led to a majority migration from regions comprising the erstwhile Bombay Presidency, later Maharashtra. Whereas the millennial turn notes a decisive shift with migrants hailing from North Indian states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, working in an economy that is no longer based on the textile mills. This change has had an important bearing not only on urban form and urban politics, but also on claims to urban space at large. Such fields of claims to urban space draw attention not only to the changing nature of urban sounds, but also the intensification of temporally punctuated rhythms for the amplification into noise. For instance, on 2nd April 2022, the occasion of Gudi Padwa, or the first day of the Maharashtrian New Year, Raj Thackeray, the leader of the political party Maharashtra Navnirman Sena, warned the Shiv Sena and the Rashtrawadi Congress coalition government in Maharashtra. And I'm quoting Raj Thackeray, "I'm warning now, remove loudspeakers from the mosques or else put loudspeakers in front of the mosque and play Hanuman Chalisa." I end the quote. Eid ul-Fitr, the festival marking the end of Ramadan fasting period, would be celebrated in the same year a month later on May 3, 2022. If following Lokmanya Tilak, the public processions of the Ganpati festival were claimed by the Shiv Sena in the form of the Maha-Aartis during the early 1990s, the audience that the invocation of Hanuman Chalisa aimed to tap into was this linguistic Hindi-speaking group, which the Navnirman Sena sought to control a decade earlier by invoking the idea of Mumbai's carrying capacity. Urban policy since the colonial era has attempted to discipline and tame sound, particularly its amplification. For instance, the Towns Nuisances Act of 1889 for Madras town decreed a penalty on offenses committed in public space on conviction either to fine or not exceeding 50 rupees or to imprisonment not exceeding 8 days for whosoever uses a sound amplifier in public space except at such times and places and subject to conditions approved by the police department official not below the rank of a deputy superintendent of police. And this is in 1889 in Madras. From the late 19th century, from the late 19th century analogy of nuisance to the 1960s analogy of abatement, the 1970s and 1980s analogy of pollution control, and the 1990s focus on health hazard, there's been a shift in the way in which policy on noise, on sound in cities has been shaped and transformed, and sound has been attempted to be disciplined and tamed. But amplifications accentuate existing socioeconomic fault lines and urban fears and desires as sonic waves pierce physical and cognitive boundaries in ways that the ocular remains limited in doing, in spite of their intersections. Noise here then is not merely an increase in decibel levels, but also draws sharp attention to the cultures of listening, or conversely, silence and even deafness. Sonic waves are made into noise first and foremost through a cultural framing of sound. And second, if industrial modernization produced the possibilities for the amplification of sound, for instance, think the loudspeaker as an amplifier, the gun, the jet plane, so on and so forth, architectures of amplification could offer as a heuristic device to explore the assemblages and networks and relationships of production, consumption, and representation of urban sound, which together could constitute the cultures of listening. It is to this provocation that this panel is framed. And in framing this panel, we've invited two very serious thinkers, artists, and practitioners. Our first speaker today, our first panelist today is Dr. Brahma Prakash, Assistant Professor of Theatre and Performance Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He's a scholar of folk culture and performance traditions in South Asia. He's the author of Cultural Labor, Conceptualizing the Folk Performance in India. His working project, Epical Subjects and the Questions of Cultural Justice in India, is an attempt to theorize cultural justice in India through the performance of epic and narrative traditions of the subaltern communities. His nonfiction on art, culture, politics, and his nonfiction on art, culture, and politics, Body on the Barricades, Life and Art Under the Authoritarian Regime, will be coming out soon from Leftward Books in 2023. His popular columns on art, culture, and politics frequently appear in Scroll, Wire, Outlook, Indian Cultural Forum, and other media platforms. With that introduction, I welcome Brahma Prakash. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. Lawrence Abu Hamdan, our second panelist for the day, is a privateer, listening to and with and on behalf of people affected by corporate, state, and environmental violence. Abu Hamdan's work has been presented in the form of forensic reports, lectures, and live performances, films, publications, and exhibitions all over the world. He received his PhD in 2017 and has held fellowships and professorships at the University of Chicago, the New School, New York, and most recently at the Johannes Gutenberg University, Maine, where he developed his research, Air Pressure Info. Abu Hamdan's audio investigations have been used as evidence at the UK Asylum and Immigration Tribunal, and been a key part of advocacy campaigns for organizations such as Amnesty International, Defense for Children International, and Forensic Architecture. His projects that reflect on the political and the cultural context of sound and listening have been presented at the 22nd Biennale of Sydney, the 58th Venice Biennale, the 11th Guangzhou Biennale, and the 13th, 14th Sharjah Biennale, with David, Rotterdam, Tate Modern Tanks, Chisenhale Gallery, Hammer Museum, Los Angeles, Orticus, Frankfurt. These works are a part of collections at Reina Sofia MoMA, Guggenheim, Hamburger Bahnhof, Van Abbey Museum, Center Pompidou, and Tate Modern. Abu Hamdan has been awarded the 2020 Toronto Biennial Audience Award, the 2019 Edward Munch Art Award, the 2016 Nam June Paik Award for New Media. And in 2017, his film Rubber Coated Steel won the Tiger Shot Award at the Rotterdam International Film Festival. For the 2019 Turner Prize, Abu Hamdan, together with nominated artists Helen Kamok, Oscar Murillo, and Tai Shani, formed a temporary collective in order to be jointly granted the award. Welcome, Lawrence. It's a pleasure to have you over here. What we'll do in the panel is we'll invite Brahma to start off the presentation first, followed by Abu Hamdan. We kind of have 25-minute presentations from both our panelists, followed by a short conversation amongst us, and then we'll open up the conversation to the audience. So yes, Brahma, over to you. Again, welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, so thank you, Rohit. Thank you so much for inviting me for this fascinating series of conversation that I'm very much looking forward. And let me confess that neither I work on architecture or nor on amplification. So I was also feeling that how I'm going to be fit into this panel. So what I'm trying to do that I will try to make some conversation, and I think that there is a possibility that we can have some dialogue. First of all, I have very bad cough, so in between, maybe I will be creating a lot of noise. So please bear with me, and sorry for that. Yeah, so I work on folk art and performance culture from North India. But in my recent work, and largely on the kinds of opinion pieces, I keep writing about several things. And I've been thinking through objects and artistic pieces to understand the cultural phenomena of our time. I bring these objects at the intersection of politics and aesthetics. And I'm quite inspired by John Berger. And I keep looking for figurative image and resonance to understand the art and ideology of our time. I have written on short pieces on bulldozer and how bulldozer also appears as a certain kinds of art object, DJ music, and lynching, where I am taking lynching as an art of installation, and so on. Here I would like to discuss a piece that I wrote in a scroll a few months back, and that was on what I called disc jockey Hindutva, where a particular kinds of cultural phenomena is shaping the Indian politics in a massive, massive ways. So I've discussed how this jockey Hindutva, a spinning electronic music blends techno and trance, devotional and national, bhakti and vibration, a speech, beat and slogan, create a toxic environment of hatred, and how to understand these kinds of musical practices that is becoming part of the public sphere. The sound of Hindutva is no longer Om if you're thinking about Hinduism, and then one can resonate with the certain kinds of musical rendition of Om. But I would like to argue that the sound of Hindutva is no longer Om, but it is a verse of this Om, and it has become boom, boom, boom. High on hatred, it dances on the rock and plays on the beat. Hindutva has showed that music can lead to silencing the minority, and festival can be a harbinger of hate. So before I go further, I would like to place 1-2 videos to give you a sense that what kinds of music I'm discussing about and how these kinds of music also intersects both this idea of the music and noise and with this whole idea of amplification of architecture. So when I'm saying amplification of architecture, not necessarily I'm talking about some physical entity in that sense, but I'm talking about larger political ecology or ecology in a larger sense. So let us hear the song and after that, we'll come to the discussion. Hope I am audible and everything is clear.
No, we can't hear your sound, or is it just me? No, we can't hear your sound.
Sorry. So you can't hear the music?
Yeah, no, we can't.
Oh, sorry. Okay, let me just. Is it audible now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
राम राज अब आएगा, मुल्क बनाए, हिंदू राष्ट्र ना बना देश सब, हिंदू धोखा खाए, हिंदू राष्ट्र ना बना देश सब।
तो उसमें इस तरह की प्रेरणा जरूर है गाने में कि भाई ये दूसरे वर्ग के लोग सुधर जाएं, नहीं तो ऐसा नहीं है कि तुम जो चाहोगे वही होगा।
It is not yet a mainstreamed kinds of music, but it is spreading very fast. It's just a matter of time that it can become like one of the major genres.
हिंदुस्तान में रहना हो तो वंदे मातरम कहना सीखो,
वंदे मातरम कहना सीखो और औकात में रहना सीखो।
It calls for blood and violence. So earlier the song was based on the certain idea of the unity. Now music are based on othering, that you are always trying to other one community, and it becomes a very genocidal in its tone, that you have whole genocidal kinds of approach in these songs.
सरकारी जमीन पे कब्जा हुआ है और एमसीडी की जमीन है, उनके पास दस्तावेज हैं, तो वो तो अपनी रिकवरी करेंगे ना। जब वो लोग विदेशी हैं जी, वो इन्फिल्ट्रेशन करके एंट्री हुए हैं और बांग्लादेशी और रोहिंग्याज मुस्लिम ज्यादा हैं, यहाँ के नहीं है वो, इसलिए वहां विवाद बढ़ रहा है, कुछ भी नहीं है।
One more short clip and yes. Yeah, so this is the music genre I'm going to talk about and how it is changing this whole sphere of public sphere, whole idea of the public sphere, and the notion of it is bringing somehow this idea of the music and noise together to create something, this whole politics of hate that we can talk about. Because if you're thinking about in the previous decades in India, it sometimes took a provocative speech from a leader for a violence to spill into the street. Now it seems all needs a DJ. You just need to play a DJ, and there is a whole possibility that violence can spill in the street. So you play the music and violence will reverberate in the street. It is not the leader now, but the amplified power of the noise that brings the disparate class together. You start listening, you move to dance, and by the time you realize it, you were already in the trance. And again, you become part of that kinds of movement. These are the songs that make participants feel energized and make their blood boil. And you have an interview of one participant, and he says that the person is saying that when we listen to the song, we feel strengthened. We get the feeling that we want to kill every single Muslim around. One participant in procession said, The connotation to violence, the notion of sacrifice, and that is where I want to theorize that with the connotation to violence, the notion to sacrifice, and murderous feeling, this whole murderous idea of feeling, asks us to think this proliferating DJ music or Hindutva pop as a sacrificial music. So you have interesting work by Atali, and Atali would make this whole he's when he's talking about noise and when he's trying to conceptualize this political economy of music, then somehow he makes a distinction that how we have moved from sacrificial idea of the music to more exchange idea of the music, more market idea of the music. But precisely, I would like to problematize that idea, and I would say that it is not happening precisely because here you have very interesting kinds of intersection is happening where music still remains very much part of the market, very much part of the commercial exchange, but it is also becoming sacrificial at the same time. So I draw from Atali's work on noise, political economy of music, to draw this connection. Atali emphasizes the centrality of sound and noise in the formation of modern political subjectivities and the modes of civic engagement. The politics also, because I also teach here a course here on Chinese aesthetics, and in Chinese aesthetics you have a whole emphasis on this idea of the music and rights. Because you could read Confucianism, you could read Mosa, who was a student of Confucius, then what you will find interesting that how they are trying to create a balance between music and right. And the whole emphasis was that there should be so how rights or the ritual should regulate the music. And music somehow becomes this idea of the desire. So, and also many times music in Chinese language gets translated as music as a happiness. So when they write, then you never know that whether the scholar is writing about music or whether the scholar is writing about happiness. And you have sentence like that music is a fundamental right. And then you realize that whether a scholar is talking about music is fundamental right or happiness is fundamental right. But what I'm trying to emphasize that how even Chinese aesthetics mode, there has been a whole emphasis on how to regulate music and how rituals or rites should regulate music, and there should be a balance between two. So this politics has been very much part of the state formation. This politics has been the very much part of the citizenship codification, and therefore we need to think these kinds of musical formation in that way. So in this regard, scholars have discussed about the sound bridge, and you have a lot of work there where scholars have talked about the sound bridge in ritual and festival context, because I think because most of these musics are getting produced in a festival context. And last time Ram Navami was the event when this music proliferated in a major ways. So you have Catherine Hardy, she has worked in the context of Chhat Puja, and she said this is giving examples of Juhu beach of Mumbai, and says that we have a staging of festival and sound. The sound that also many times perceived as noise, because it is also produced by subaltern communities in that sense. And so how among Bihari community, despite how others feel, among the Bihari community, these sounds create a certain kinds of bonding. It creates a certain notions of community, and that is the way we can see that. On the other side, there are studies to show how right-wing political parties have appropriated this festival by toning down earthly sonic noise. So even if you're thinking about Chhat festival or any local festival, then the sound and music they are producing, that is merging or somewhere creating this whole making a erasure between music and noise that we can discuss about. But I am indicating towards another process in which Hindutva pop and the video that you have seen can be seen as a sacrificial form of music. As we have seen in the video, this music asks for blood and sacrifice. It follows the patterns of ritual music in which people participate in the series of acts and almost goes to the level of trance. Music openly calls for lynching of specific communities by channelizing the energy and the ecology around. Following Atali, we can say that it channelizes violence, it produces differences through sublimation of noise and orders the noise that can be considered either ritual music or channelized or oriented noise to target a specific community in that sense. Atali argues that such forms of noise announces the installation of a new totalizing social order based on a spectacle and exteriority. And perhaps this is what we can relate with the formation of Hindutva pop here. So you have largely if you're thinking about them, largely even if you're thinking about songs, then songs are coming from either ritual context or religious context without erasing their efficacy. So either so if you're thinking about either just Ram song, or you are thinking about more specific songs about Hindutva pop, then you will find that these songs already had certain kinds of religious and visual connotation, and it is now becoming part of the certain kinds of one can say public sphere. And in the public, when these songs are coming to the public sphere, not necessarily they are able to erase their own past. It is very much coming with the force of the ritual. It is coming with the very force of the religious efficacy. And when it is getting in this part of the commercial kinds of production or these kinds of mass dissemination, then it is able to create certain kinds of new level or new kinds of heightened mode. So while one expects that music would lose law, like this has been a kind of Walter Benjamin's idea that how music and art are going to lose their aura, it will get de-ritualized. That was the idea, that in the new kinds of formation and new kinds of public connotation, that music is going to this music and art are going to lose their aura and getting more de-ritualized. But what is simultaneously happening here, that music is getting more ritualized, and at the same time it is getting exteriorized from its own community. So it happens rather other way around, where technological sensorium pushes the bodies into primordial formation, noise becomes a weapon, and music a simulacrum of ritual murder. Every song enacts a massacre, and music enacts the violence. Attali makes a distinction between formation of noise and music before it becomes part of exchange. So he's making clearly dividing this whole period, that when music was before, music was not part of the commercial kinds of exchange, and then music supposed to be played this kinds of ritual role or religious role, where music was more a kinds of was getting offered as a certain kinds of sacrifice. But even if you're thinking about Indian context, then music is considered one of the best offering in many kinds of contexts. Either you're thinking about religious context, ritual context, and many times music is getting gets properly offered as a certain kinds of entity to the deity, to the temple, to the community in that sense. So how music becomes parts of exchange, and after the exchange, so in my view, what is happening in these kinds of DJ Hindutva, that in my view, DJ Hindutva brings both aspects together. At the level of architecture of finance, it amplifies the sacrificial aspect of the noise. It still helps in creating a political order and the ritualization of the murder substituted by the call for lynching. In other words, Hindutva pop becomes the sites of ritual sacrifice. So what is happening? So many times ritual works in two ways. Because one, that you are trying to create some kinds of environment, you are trying to create some kinds of ecology, you are creating through certain kinds of repetition, you are able to create some kinds of ecology already, creating certain kinds of ecology. So what is happening, that not necessarily we are able to see direct lynching with these kinds of song, but there is a possibility that both the sides can come together, or both the acts can come together, where the lynching crowds are participating in the music. And that we have seen during the last Ram Navami, that almost the people who were participating in these kinds of musical procession or these kinds of ceremonial procession, they were also started attacking mosque. They started attacking communities, and that shows that how music can easily break these kinds of boundaries and can become a part of the social. So Hindutva pop become the sites of ritual sacrifice. However, I would like to underline an important distinction here. Many times ritual violence and sacrifice are conducted to avoid real violence. And if we understand about ritual violence and the way many scholars discuss, then what we find that many times to avoid violence, community used to participate in ritual violence to get some kinds of healing. If we are thinking about Adivasi communities, then they also enact different kinds of ritual violence, but not necessarily to perpetuate violence, but to contain violence. Here the things are going other way around. Where this whole ritual sacrifice is taking place not necessarily to contain violence, but to perpetuate violence and to create certain kinds of psychic kinds of a sphere where body and psyche both are coming together to participate in these kinds of sacrificial music. And this has been a kind of So it is through Hindutva pop, violence gets normalized. Second one is that violence getting perpetuated, and second, violence is also getting normalized, and the imagined center of religious and caste superiority that gets actualized. So many times, when you are thinking about these kinds of music, then many times they also refers to the past. They are also referring to the history, and what they are trying to locate these kinds of. They are trying to create very imagined center in which ritual can be placed. Because when we are thinking about ritual, the notion of sacredness, then the violence idea of the sacrifice becomes central. And to locate that idea of the violence and sacrifice, you need to have certain notion of the sacredness, certain notion of the center. And if we are going to try to make these kinds of assumption or certain kinds of speculation, then we will see that how through certain kinds of temporal claim, the Hindutva Pope is able to create certain idea of the center, and what they're trying to actualize, that the center that is going to create certain kinds of sacrifice. So that has been the kinds of my intervention. I know that most of you are coming from very different field. So if you need some clarification and things that we can discuss during the question and answer session, but I hope I have made some kinds of like connections there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brahma. Thanks for that wonderful intervention, and loved listening to your talk and connecting it to the two videos that you played. And several things stood out for me in your talk, and kind of going to kind of note down a few of them. The first, that trance music shapes a soul which aims to perpetuate violence, and kind of the spirit that is kind of getting generated, a collective spirit that is getting generated. And here, the festival becomes an important moment of time, or kind of the creation of a festival becomes an important moment of time, whether it is resorting to older festivals or maybe newer festivals that might be getting shaped or kind of getting mobilized with this. Maybe that DJ music that you showed, I didn't catch whether it was a part of some festival that belongs that it was played in some festival that is associated with Hindu communities, or it is a new festival that kind of gets mobilized in the process. I didn't catch that, but old or new festival gets.
Sorry, I'm just interjecting. Yeah, it was a Ram Navami. All these festivals that you have seen, and most of the videos appeared that came during this last Ram Navami festival.
During the last Ram Navami. And the festival, then what also strikes me is that the festival has an architecture. The festival has an architecture that one could consider in many ways. One, it is an architecture which is spatial in a certain sense. So what kinds of spaces does it play out in? And what kinds of spaces in cities and what locations does it kind of mark? But beyond the spatial location itself, it has an architecture of several other kinds. For instance, how it is an architecture of what kinds of money comes in, how does it circulate, who are the actors involved in it. So there's an institutional architecture, there's a financial architecture, and probably one could start thinking and opening out architecture that connects both physical spaces and relational spaces in terms of the urban form, but also in terms of the institutional form, as well as finances and several other kinds that one could start building relationships in. And so this kind of connection is useful to think of in terms of what is getting amplified and also what is kind of getting silenced and othered in this space. So thank you for making that intervention. I'll invite Lawrence Abu Hamdan, our second speaker, who will take us from India into the space of Lebanon, Beirut. Welcome, Lawrence. It's a pleasure to have you here again. I'll switch off my cam in case you need me. You can just call out.
Okay, sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Rohit and Rupali, for the invitation. I'll just set up the presentation. There we go. Okay, wait 1 second. So my project concerns those little dots in the sky that come tearing through the skies of Lebanon. That's an Israeli fighter jet, and I have been conducting a kind of research into the phenomenon of the soiree, the military soiree, the mock raids, over the lockdown period and until recently published the work, concluded 3 sort of parts of that work by the fall of 2022. So I'm talking about a very recent project. The umbrella of this project is called air pressure. Now, what's interesting about these soirees, these mock raids of the Israeli army above Lebanese airspace, is that they're not most of the time as obvious as that. This is one of the few times where they become low enough where we can sort of identify the source of sound to the jet that's producing that noise. Most of the time, they just sort of hover in the atmosphere and they kind of create this ambiguous rumble. It's not very loud, but it's produces a kind of precarity and a kind of fear and a kind of dread. I've done a website which is the first kind of interactive aggregate and database that is published all the information about these aircraft. I'm going to talk mostly about that part of the project, which is the sort of investigative side of what I do. It's also an installation comprising of the images you see behind me, which I'll explain later, and a film called Air Pressure, Diary of the Sky, or in Arabic, درجة جو يوميات السماء. So the project started during lockdown. Commercial traffic was completely down, but the skies above Lebanon were very loud, right? So of course, somehow lockdown, being inside in the quiet, amplified the presence of these jets. Lockdown was also, of course, a time where things felt limited, where things formerly taken for granted, like a limitless sky above your head, suddenly feel like a ceiling, right? And sort of increase the feeling of enclosure. But it also started I started to become interested in it then. But then it started to get much more intense, the research, and much more a kind of specific goal when the explosion of August 4th happened in Beirut. The ammonium nitrate that was stored in the port exploded. And basically there was all this debate whether or not people had heard planes just before the explosion. And there was, the debate was, I became involved in that debate. At some point realized that it was unproductive because we were speaking about whether there was a plane at 6:07 p.m. on the 4th of August, but no one was really speaking about the fact that there were 440 planes the month before, 440 planes in 1 month coming into the atmosphere. So it was this strange sort of conundrum that the project finds himself in. The moment of peak anxiety of a massive event, the plane comes to be a signifier, right? The plane, the noise of the plane leaves the background, exits this kind of space of murmuring in the distance, and comes right to the foreground and becomes a kind of explainer. So it tells me that this thing is always there, that in moments of peak anxiety, it comes, it emerges, and it pulls forth into the discourse. But most of the time, it's kind of lost its discursive value, that it's become so routine and so commonplace that we sort of stop talking about them in their quotidian form. We only talk about them in these moments of kind of exceptional violence. Of course, just to clarify, I don't believe there was a plane heard before the explosion, but it's just to sort of give you an example of the way it sort of circulates in debate and the way it kind of takes part of the kind of noise on the street and the chatter. So, when I sort of realized that we were talking that this object has both a kind of immediate and background concern. It sort of occupies both the forefront and the background of people's kind of consciousness, and it kind of moves ambivalently between the two. I decided I decided that actually there was not enough that we knew about these aircrafts, and I decided to turn my ear quite carefully to the sky, listening to the sounds of the different kinds of engines, trying to identify them, working with aeroacoustic experts, building as much as I could from those rumbles and hums and buzzes above me. Little did I know then that all the information I was looking for was actually available in the open source. Now, I wouldn't say it's entirely open source because it took a lot of digging into very buried documents, but there had been 243 letters written between two UN bodies, the UNIFIL in Lebanon, the UN Federation International for, I actually don't know what it stands for, I need to look that up, and the UN Security Council in New York. And these letters actually had all the radar information of every single one of these flights that we know of. There was 243 of them. They were letters, they were not digitized, and they were a kind of complete mess in the way that they had been stored. Some of them were about a week, some of them were about 3 months, some of them were about 2 days. So they were all over the place. There seemed to be no kind of systematic logic to them. And so my task became very simple at that point once I'd found this archive. And first I found, like, let's say February 2007. Then I found May 2019, a week in May 2019, and that by keep kind of digging and moving through the UN Digital Archive, I managed to patch together almost all of the 15 years since the last peace truce that was signed in 2006. So after that time, the last invasion in 2006, the actual bombardment of Israeli jets in Lebanon, there was an agreement that the UN would monitor the border. And so this is the information we have dates back to 2006, though I will talk about some other previous times during this talk. So there was just a very simple task in front of me, a very simple but long one, right? There was all this mess of data. It had been somehow obfuscated, even if not by intention, but certainly by form. That's all I can say as to the alleged obfuscation of these crimes. And so it just seemed to be that we would put this once and for all in one single site, in one single database. Because actually the experience of these planes are quite atomized, right? Let's say I'm boiling a kettle, I don't hear it, but my friend calls me, he's heard it, right? Or I'm driving a car and then, I'm in another part of the country, and they're quite brief passing, right? As you see there, it's just, takes a few seconds before it's out of audibility. But when you look at it as a 15-year kind of excess of noise, of kind of waste decibel that had been pumped into the atmosphere, it starts to tell a different story. And that was what was really interesting about aggregating this information. So I produced this website called airpressure.info, and this was the sort of database from which people could learn about what was happening. So what did we learn from doing this aggregated data? The first and only now aggregated database, because later the Lebanese government actually contacted me about this. And when I was making the work, I was always imagining that I was producing a database that was standing in somehow in place of an inaccessible state archive that we couldn't reach. In fact, now I know that there is no such thing, and this is actually the only one, and now the state uses it and whoever uses it to the same ends. So what did this mass aggregation teach us the first time we ever kind of put these numbers together? It told us that 22,111 flights have happened in the last 15 years. 8,231 of those are fighter jets, and 13,000 are unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. That each of these flights last an average of 4 hours and 35 minutes. The longest recorded flight time lasts 30 hours. So that's one long exception. That's a UAV. So that's a sustained A sharp for 30 hours. the combined flight time of all of these flights, when you add them all up, actually amounts to 8.5 years. So of the last 15 years, more than half of that time has been populated with the sound of these jets. And this was, of course, an unimaginable scale. No one could have known that these were the facts before we'd put all this information together. I think someone at the UN may have had an idea, but also if they're just concentrating on a few months here and there, they wouldn't have ever seen this in its totality. Yeah, and what else can I say? Yeah, so what else did it teach us? Other important findings emerged. And, you know, when I was doing the work before I found this database, what I would hear a lot in the South from people, and a lot of people exposed to this, is the belief, and it was mine too, that these planes were on their way to bomb Syria or to survey Syria. But in fact, once we put these trajectories in place, we realized that wasn't the case, that they had, there was only 2 such incidents in the entire 22,000 that had left Lebanese airspace and gone into Syrian airspace. So this told us that this is a specific operation targeting Lebanon and its populace. And presumably they have another one doing the same in Syria, and the same in Gaza, and the same in the West Bank. So another interesting thing was the fact that the Air Force Israeli Air Force intensifies operation by at least 10% on average each summer, sometimes much more. So there's a much larger increase in the summer months. From an acoustic perspective, that's when there is a great deal of humidity in the atmosphere. Humidity is up almost 4 to 8 times that what it is earlier in the year, in January, for example. So it's also a kind of interesting question, because why then take, you know, it start to disturb the sense that this is a surveillance operation, because you wouldn't want to take photography with a great deal of atmospheric haze. You know, of course, the more humidity in the atmosphere, the more vapor in the atmosphere, the more you get these kind of milky photographs, right? That don't really reveal very much. Then it's much better to take it way up from satellites and these kind of things. But so, or you know, and to take those images when the skies are drier. And from an acoustic perspective, of course, humidity increases the high frequencies. The air is denser. Higher frequencies travel much accelerated through denser atmospheres than they do through drier ones. And therefore you had this sense that somehow the humidity is colluding with these jets to make them more piercing in a high frequency. At the time when, of course, all of this diaspora come to Lebanon, the summer is a very important moment for Lebanon, for its diasporic tourism. But also because that's when people have their weddings, right? And all these kind of links of people coming back in are kind of made, the links from the diaspora to the country. And in some ways we could see those jets as trying to kind of sever those ties as they pass through the country. And so in many ways, you know, you have to see that sound as a kind of theft of the future, right? As the sound in the atmosphere steals the possibility to imagine and plan for your future, right? Because what that sound is communicating is that we can hit at any time, right? That the future can simply be canceled. It can be interrupted at any moment that is of their choosing. So it's deeply threatening in that sense and produces a great deal of kind of precarity. So I say the sound kind of thieves the future. It's a sound that thieves the future. I want to just say one other thing here is that, or maybe I'll skip that. How am I doing for time? Okay. Also, you know,
it takes some time, not a problem.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the other thing that was interesting for me or kind of challenge for this project is to get it spoken about. Its discursive value was only achievable through the discussion of the violation of airspace, of sovereignty. And that seemed to me as a problem, right? So, you know, I had The Guardian write about this, had everything write about, all the newspapers write about it when it was released. But of course, the main sort of narrative of that discourse was as a sovereign violation. And it occurred to me that that wasn't really an adequate way of describing this. One, because that had the consequence of territorializing the air, saying that that is Lebanese air, right? And what I was trying to say is that air doesn't belong to anyone and certainly shouldn't be turned violent by anybody, right? Shouldn't be activated in a violent way by anybody. And also because I don't believe the Lebanese government has a mandate over that air. I don't believe it belongs to them in particular. They are also, as we will see later in this presentation, deeply implicated in forms of expropriation of the air, of the atmosphere, and part of a kind of toxicity that is inseparable from these jets. So it was this issue, and I think what I tried to do with the work, as you see, with these maps, I mean, here you see it starts with 1 or 2 lines that intersect a kind of airspace, a territorial plane that we can understand in the shape of Lebanon. But over time, as we kind of accumulate them, it looks much, as the noise kind of accumulates, it looks much more like a cartography of pressure rather than space. There's a kind of weight of pressure bearing down on people rather than a set of trajectories. And that was really the point for this kind of accumulation of data, to really see that. Because on the one hand, I wanted it to be spoken about, right? I needed that kind of discourse of the sovereign violation for it to even enter the news and to even become discursive. And yet, it needed also to exceed that. And I think that's why some of this kind of form was decided upon. Also, what's interesting is that, you know, I never map out Lebanon, right? It's not, the outlines of Lebanon are never there as we know it. It's just the cities that are there. The shape is actually formed by the trajectories. I mean, there's not one corner of Lebanon they haven't touched. So it's kind of interesting that in the end, we do end up with the kind of map of Lebanon, but it's actually a map of trajectories that produce that space and those outlines, rather than a kind of territorial condition otherwise understood. Sorry, I'll just show you a little bit of this website. From this violations page, you can see, oops. Right, let me just prepare this a little better. Yeah, all right, so I was showing you a screen share there, but you see this thing. You can also search. You can see, you know, on 23rd of November, what happened. You can see where the plane went on this occasion, where it went on that occasion. You can see the trajectory of these fighter jets on the 29th of September, 2021. You can search by aircraft. You can search by months. You can search by years. And then I made this page, which is called In the Sky, and that tried to become a kind of lexicon of the noises that we hear above us. So that's the sound of a recording of an F-16. So we kind of identified these sounds and tried to kind of define their sonic profile in order so that people are aware of what they're hearing above them, because that was also a big concern. This is a F-35. So you can hear the difference there. One much bassier, and you have to bear in mind that these planes also take up about almost a 500 square kilometer radius of audibility. So they take up vast swathes of land. If that's coming across the coastline, the whole of Lebanon will hear it, even maybe some of Syria. So this is a missile, the loudest of all of them. Then I compare that to a passenger jet, which has about an 87 or 90 square kilometer audible radius. So much smaller than what we're used to. This is the Heron. And this is the Hermes drone, 2 Israeli Air Force drones. The quadcopter doesn't have a sound, as we know, unless we're very close to it. And then the Lebanese army aircrafts that we hear in the, so really to make a distinction between what we're hearing above us, because in many ways, this whole campaign of flights rids us of, it turned the sky against us. Right? It makes us question everything we hear above our heads. So it's not only active when the Israeli jets are there, it makes you question every sound you're hearing above your head, whether it's hostile or not. And it's the kind of production of a it's a kind of loss or a questioning of one's diagnostic capacities all the time. So that's that page. And then in the April of 2021, as I was kind of charting these planes and listening to them, we stopped being able to hear the jets clearly. We could hear that there's something in the atmosphere, but there was another rumble present, and that was the rumble of electricity generators. And what happened was that the Lebanese state had dropped its electricity supply from 20 hours to 14 hours. So there was a massive increase in electricity generators for powering homes and neighborhoods, which of course start to produce a lot of noise. That engines on the ground are about 70 decibels. That's about what we hear the fighter jets at most of the time. And they kind of occupy the same sort of frequency. So there was a moment where we stopped being able to hear the difference between a fighter jet and a generator. Actually, these two lethal entities began to mask one another. The two lethal entities being state-sanctioned corruption, warlord capitalism, and enemy invasion, hostile enemy invasion. These two lethal entities started masking one another and started kind of colluding in the atmosphere and coalescing in ways which were inseparable. And that meant that my study started to become less kind of granular and forensic and more atmospheric. It kind of embraced a kind of atmospheric mode of analysis, which looked to the coalition of noise. It also, tried to understand the air as a kind of volatile compound, not just of noise, but of carbon dioxide, monoxide, dread, nitrogen oxide, sulfur oxide, and all the other toxic emissions of international militarism and corruption and warlord capitalism. And then later in that month, about 600 tons of fish washed up dead in the Araun lake. And they were carp, a kind of quite resilient type of fish. And they died of a as yet unknown viral epidemic. Now, in Lebanon, they have been dumping in this water for a long time, and it's actually been banned as a kind of site of irrigation because of how toxic it's been. But the fish have never just suddenly died like that, but it's been very toxic for a long time. When I was doing this work to look through the UN database, what one of the entries read is that at 6:05 on the 22nd of October, 6 months before these fish died, 2 Israeli fighter jets entered Lebanon, and one of these planes dropped an unidentified object into the lake. There's not another precedent for them dropping something in this whole 22,000 that I could find. This is it. And what they dropped into the lake, I don't know. It's highly possible that whatever they dropped in had nothing to do with the uninhabitable state into which the lake's waters descended. Lebanon is perfectly capable of having made this lake uninhabitable on its own. And that's really the kind of point. And if you look at that's not to rid the responsibility of the Israeli Air Force for committing such a crime, but exactly to understand the kind of the coalition of these crimes, the ways in which they meet each other. And if we look at the Israeli military strategy for Lebanon, it confirms that. So the Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz, I'm not sure if he's part of the current government, that he was when I wrote this piece. He says Lebanon's situation is shaky, we can make it even shakier, right? So basically what he's doing is he's describing the ways in which the state is already failing, and saying that they can exert pressure in the points where it already fails its people, right? So Lebanon's situation is shaky. We can make it even shakier. So it's about how he wants to seamlessly incorporate military activity into an already toxic atmosphere. And interesting enough, also evokes vibration as a means to do that, shakiness, right? Instability, the ground itself shaking, the air shaking, the particles of air activated through noise is really key in that description, and very articulate about the kind of atmospheric violence that he seeks to commit. The other part of the website is called On the Ground, and it's let me just see here if I can show you that as it is on the page. Here it's on the ground, so you see here all of the discourse of this online. You see the fighter jets, you see all the tweets that ever come about this, and they all kind of get aggregated into this database. They're clustered around the times in which they're things. So this is January 2021. You can see there's a lot of activity. But then let's say if we move down to July 2020, not so much, or a couple of moments here and there. And this is interesting because it doesn't only tell you about, this is an interesting resource because it doesn't just tell you about what is happening and the numbers, but how it kind of gives you a window into living under hostile jets, living in a violent air, in a violently produced atmosphere. And so it became another important part of the analysis, kind of discourse analysis as well as the atmospheric one. Yeah, different kinds of tweets here. This is like, I would classify as the Inquirer, you know, where people post like questions. Does anybody know where these missiles are coming from? You know, like people asking questions. Or is there war in the skies over Beirut? And these tweets are all gathered over a hashtag called Harbi Ba'ajwa, which means war in the atmosphere. So is there war in the atmosphere over Beirut? Someone asks, and then a thread would unfold. You have a kind of group of people who are sort of citizen reporters, almost like myself, you know, and they would report exactly when and where these jets are heard and act as kind of witnesses on the ground, sort of documenting these flights. So this one says, a squadron of Israeli fighter jets violates Lebanese sovereignty over towns Kfar Kala, Hammamas, and goes to Marja'yun, Hasbaya, Al Ar'ub, and all this. So that's that category. You also have the jokers, of course. You know, it's Twitter after all. This one says, these sons of bitches, or however you want to translate that, Akhwat al-Sharmuta, kept flying at a low altitude to the point where it got they get stuck in my laundry line. You know, it cut my laundry line. They're going so low. And this is another one, kind of sarcastic. Good morning to the traffic. Morning to the Harbi Ba'ajwa, the war in the atmosphere. Good morning to the low-flying jets that do not leave us alone. A good day to you all. And then there's this sort of fear, right, that is also documented, where someone says, there's war in low altitude. May God protect us from whatever they have in their arsenal. Do not play with fire. Yeah, and so this is the website. And the research also became a film. I made a film out of these videos that you would find online, and the tweets and the whole history of it. It's called Air Pressure the Sky, and in that I tried to do more than the website, which focuses on one sky. I tried to show the kind of intersection of skies, a kind of set of entwined skies, and we moved from German, Israeli, Lebanese, and also, of course, the United States, United Kingdom, Italy, Netherlands, Australia, Norway, Denmark, and Canada. When each of those countries invested $400 billion into the production of the F-35. Israel has a very special status within of those countries because though it did not invest, I mean, it has bought some F-35s, of course. It's the only country that's allowed to adapt the systems on the F-35. Everyone else, that even the countries who invested in it, like Netherlands, cannot touch it. They have to get a pre-approval by Pentagon facilities to change and adapt the systems, or they have to, they'll never get pre-approval. They have to send it even for repair at Pentagon-run facilities. The only country that can do its own repairs, its own adaptation, are Israel. And that's, of course, because they have the most kind of real-world opportunity to test these aircraft for all the countries who invested this $400 billion into the production of the plane. And so Lebanon is a kind of high pressure nexus in a global weather system, right? In the military industrial complex. It's not just a place where fighter jets joyride. It's actually a kind of laboratory, and it's somehow kind of expensive real estate. I mean, $400 billion is enough to reverse the entire effects of climate change, according to some environmental activists. And there's another, of course, very tangible sky in which the Lebanese air is in contiguity. And that really showed itself in May 2021 with a kind of strange anomaly in my database. You see, in May 2021, there was just 4 Israeli fighter jets that came into the atmosphere. They both came on the same day. They had the same, more or less, trajectory. Or I think one went up the coast, the other went around the country. They came together, close proximity to each other. Then after that, nothing. No more fighter jets. The whole month, nothing. And of course, from May 2021, after in response to the expropriation of land in Sheikh Jarrah, Jerusalem, a major assault on Gaza began just a few days after these fighter jets entered on the 10th of May. 256 Palestinians were killed, 1,900 were injured, 72,000 Palestinians were displaced from that attack. There was 1,500 aerial, land, and sea strikes on the Gaza Strip. Israeli airstrikes destroyed 94 buildings, comprising of 461 houses and commercial units. And so the silence, of course, in Lebanon was entirely connected to the noise that was coming out of our mobile phones when we were watching those buildings be destroyed and those lives being lost. And so it was really in the silence that we finally kind of heard, in a way, what those vehicles are capable of, not necessarily in their noise, but in their absence from our skies. And so you could see in June, they were back to business, and there was 39 the next month. So this kind of strange anomaly existed. And that kind of contiguity continues in the research when I found this book, which was a compendium of kind of leaks and articles and witness accounts of all Israeli aircraft entering Lebanon from 1949 to 1985. It's quite, it's built by citizens as well. It's called the group called Markaz al-Arabi al-Ma'lumat, like the Center for Arab Information. But these were a citizen group, not funded by anyone. Also, like myself, had done this kind of work because, of course, this is not part of the state's narrative, right? On the one hand, it shows a violation of their sovereignty, but it's also like, as I explained before, reveals them to be, also agents in the same kind of expropriation of air. It's also against people like Hezbollah, who pretend to be the resistance to the Israeli army. But this website that I produced, for example, showed that they had 22,111 moments in which they could have taken a resistance stand, and they chose none of those 22,111 opportunities. But what I learned from this book, interestingly enough, is that, of course, the first mock raid is in 1949. And and that's it's almost as old as the establishment of the state of Israel itself. We've had these fighter jets violating the air. There was one in 1949. There was 12 in 1959 across the whole year. It's more or less one a month, let's say. In 1979, there was 726. And in 2020, there was 2,347, right? So these have been increasing and going for generations now. And just as the land in Palestine, of course, the skies above Lebanon have been subjected to a protracted dispossession. And that was important for me to show in a way. In the last work, I mean, this kind of iconic graphic that we see the sort of shrinking land in Palestine, something was happening there similar to that of the Lebanese air, right? But I felt I wanted to make an image like that. When I read those statistics, I wanted to produce a sort of image like that. But I didn't want to territorialize the air. I didn't want to map it, as I said before. I didn't want to make a sovereign claim to it. I don't believe the claim was not that the air belongs to us, but the air is turned violent. The air has become a pressure, a weapon against us, right? The noise that travels through it is activating air as a kind of toxic environment, as a toxic substance through sound. And I wanted to make, rather than a kind of use this sort of vaporous propagation as a kind of affront to conventional forms of cartography. And I didn't want to make a map of a terrain, but a kind of cartography of pressure, as I explained before. And so I produced these images. And this is the last thing I'll speak about. This is a thing called air conditioning. And what you have here is a kind of cloudscape. Each centimeter is 1 day, as you see in the thing. Each cloud a different kind of aircraft. The little drones, the unmanned aerial vehicles, and the fighter jets each had a different kind of quality of cloud, as they do have a different kind of timbre of sound and sonic experience. And they were made, the cloudscape was made on Houdini by feeding the numbers into this computer-generated image software called Houdini. And basically what you see is that the height of the cloud is predicated on the amount of aircrafts that came in that month, and the thickness is the amount of time those aircraft spent in the atmosphere. So the thickness of the plume. And those were the parameters on which to produce this enormous cloudscape that stretches 54 meters in the gallery, but also as a digital image is revealed as such, this kind of timeline. And of course, the idea of this is to produce a kind of way of witnessing this, where we can, a new kind of way of witnessing this crime as one singular long crime, rather than as, many thousands of atomized sonic events, but one sort of long, toxic leak. To deaggregate it from the individual witness, and to let us see this as no one person could have ever seen it, right? Could have ever experienced it, but as a kind of collectivity of people living and generations living under it have somehow embodied and taken in. So it was also to try and show that sound is like a kind of air pollution. It's not separate from that. I didn't want to essentialize noise as its own kind of pollution, but to show it in congruity to other acts of noise, air pollution. But there is one key difference this is how it appears in the gallery space. There's one key difference in the way that noise pollution behaves, is that it doesn't contain, it's not separate kinds of toxin, right? It's not like you take the carbon monoxide out and the air is cleaner, right? Here, what you have is the way that noise behaves is it coalesces, right? So you have 70 decibels plus 70 decibels is not 140 decibels, right? So the 70 decibels produced by the generator and the 70 decibels produced by the aircraft do not kind of create 140 loud wall of noise, but actually they coalesce. There's still 70 decibels in the atmosphere. And that, you know, that really became a kind of articulation of the kinds of acts of resistance that were emerging in Lebanon at the time, under the slogan "Killon yani killon," which was it means all of them, and I mean all of them. And it was a sort of way of countering sectarianism and division and atomization, and showing that all these people and these leaders, Israel, Hezbollah, Walid Jumblat, Nabi Berri, all these kind of toxic forces, all need each other, right? They need each other, and we're just kind of, you know, they're not, they seem to oppose each other, but actually they need each other in their kind of efforts to maintain militarism and ill-gotten wealth, etc. So the work, I'll just end there, but by saying that the work is atmospheric, not only in the kind of violence in its mode of analysis, but also seeks to institute sort of resistance and atmospheric acts of resistance that we must learn to sort of see atmospherically and see the inseparability in order to resist these forces of violence as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Lawrence. That was really, really a very in-depth kind of presentation of the work that you've done. And air pressure kind of, you know, draws me to think about, I mean, as you mentioned, not only the air pressure, but also the pressure that is put on lives and on grounds in many different ways. As, I mean, sitting in an architecture school and both of your works.
Wait, sorry, I don't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Wait, let me
Can
just
you hear
see
me?
what's going on here. Oh, strange.
I can hear you.
Now?
The sound just cut out for me. I don't hear you.
Okay, Brahma, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Rohit.
I think it's a digital thing because when I stopped sharing, it cut. So let me just come out and rejoin.
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to start a conversation. Brahma, feel free to kind of, you know, also pose questions, common lines of inquiry. I think we've kind of gone. I was hoping we'd have half an hour for a conversation, but we have literally around 15 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, so thank you so much for also bringing some of those connections around festival architecture and other connections. And also, I think received one question from Anandit Sachdev, where he's asking that how.
Brahma, we'll take that later. Let's just make kind of, you know, some common kind of comments, and then we'll kind of start.
Okay, all right.
Sorry to disturb you. Just wanted Lawrence to join in back.
Okay.
And one of the points that I wanted to kind of, you know, make, drawing both your works together and sitting here in an architecture school, what strikes me is that both your inquiries are kind of, you know, saying that there is a new context that is emerging in cities and sound, noise in a particular ways, is asking us, particularly as architects, to think about landscape architecture or environment and space in very new kinds of ways, not the drawing of trees or basically kind of a dualism between beings and other things that, you know, we've kind of as architects come to learn about landscape architecture, kind of in both your works that kind of emerges as a very common line of inquiry. And therefore, Brahma, to kind of, you know, the doubt that you started with, whether would you be able to contribute to this conversation, these are very central, I think, to the field of architecture, where the questions are really transdisciplinary in a certain sense at this moment in time. So that's my first kind of, you know, just observation. Lawrence's work also opened out this kind of very interesting way of thinking about the relationship between the event and the everyday, where both of them are not dualistic and opposed to one another, but they also fold into one another. And Brahma, I mean, I would like you to kind of, after I finish my points, also if you can kind of, build your thoughts about the relationship between the festival as an event and an everyday, so that there's long durée to which this kind of festival gets produced, but it's not something that just emerges in an instant. So if that becomes the way of also drawing both the context of North India or India at large and Lebanon into a conversation with one another, and what kinds of inquiries can be drawn by putting both of these contexts into conversation. So that's something that would be very kind of interesting to kind of think through. I think I'll just stop over there because we have a very short time, and this is I think I'll ask both of you to respond to ways of drawing both these inquiries into conversation with one, and then we can take up the audience's questions. So maybe start with Brahma and Lawrence, then if you want to join.
Yeah. So thank you, Rohit. I think I will take my question back, because I can see many connections now, and that has been one of the revelations for me to think in terms of architecture, because of course I have been thinking around this question, and also through certain kinds of what Lefebvre would say rhythmo analysis of the city or rhythmo analysis of a space. So I was thinking through rhythm, I was thinking through music and noise, but perhaps I was not articulating through the architecture. But I think your provocation gives me a lot of again, lot of things to thought about, and also a lot of those materials to think about. So first of all, the connection that I would like to make is one thing that perhaps we are not giving attention to, this whole architecture of the body itself, that gets into a trance, that gets into certain kinds of musical formations, not necessarily because they are part of these people who are joining this musical kinds of production or festival, they're necessarily part of any party, not necessarily they belong to party, because it is the rhythm, it is the kinds of noise that brings them up, and they become part of these kinds of formation. So one that I would like to see, because in trance what happens that we also need to think in terms of architecture of the body. So architecture of the body gives a particular kinds of articulations when we are thinking about architecture of the body, but it is also archetypal emotion that we can think about. Because if you are thinking about archetypal emotion, then it also brings us to the whole psychic aspect of the music, whole psychic aspect of the rhythm analysis. And what I have been observing, but it is not just happening in one part of India, it is happening maybe across India, that most of the festivals are becoming linear. So even if you're thinking about more community festival, earlier they will organize this festival within their community, maybe within their locality and villages. Now, so you have a lot of examples from Ranchi, Jharkhand, where Adivasi community, indigenous communities also participating in a festival that is becoming more linear in a special formation. They are so earlier they would observe this festival within their locality. Now they are going to Ranchi. Somebody is going to some cities, some communities are going to some cities. So this whole formation has changed. And that also shows that how we are perhaps entering into a new kinds of architecture of the city, and how these movements are also defining our idea of the city. Second, when if you're thinking about that ritual connection or sacrifice connection that I was trying to make, because ritual is always an idea of cosmos. Because it is many times things are defined. Either you are thinking about temple, either you are thinking about altar, ritual altar, where bricks are placed, and they will say that 1,000 bricks were placed. And if you're trying to bring out take out one brick from that architecture, then you are also going to make a new intervention in that space. And perhaps I would like to see more in these kinds of ritual architecture way, where you're just many times shifting a small things. You are just adding a small music, you are just a small adding a new kinds of techno music, and then you will see that how this whole spheres are changing in a new way. And so, and that also shows that how with these kinds of very remarkable minute kinds of intervention, you are able to change the whole idea of the public sphere. So now when you are participating in the festival, then maybe like, and I was asking some youngsters who are participating in the festival, they will say that, I'm not participating in that kinds of Hindutva pop. We are just participating in a festival. But the festival itself gets communalized. If you're thinking, then there has been already a tectonic shift in the way we used to think about the festival. So same way, like when I can relate with like Lawrence presentation, then maybe with the kinds of constant movement of the flight, that has become a very normal kinds of like status in which you are going to perceive your environment. And that is what we are also perceiving the festival. So how the things that has not been a case like maybe 20 years back, now it has become part of our daily lives. So festival does not remain a kinds of like special moment in that sense. Festival is very much entering into our everyday kinds of choreography. And in that way, I would like to make these connections.
Thanks, Brahma, for that response. Lawrence, would you like to add to this, or kind of, we can go ahead. You're on mute, Lawrence.
I think Brahma's presentation was excellent, and of course we also share a kind of between the two countries we share this suffering of sectarianism. I mean, I know that caste and ethnic and religious battles in India cannot maybe be reduced to sectarianism alone, but I think it's there's many parallels there. Specifically in the kinds of corruption it endures and the ways it interpolates its subjects into and yeah, I think you hit it on the head there with the last point, that although you're not playing kind of ambient music, it in a way music becomes a kind of ambience for these kind of environment, for this sort of an ambient stage for which sectarianism thrives, right? And when I was doing the work, I was really inspired by Brian Eno's definition of ambience. When he would say that he said that he wanted his music to be ambient in the sense that it's as ignorable as it is interesting. And I think there's something going on there, similarly. And I think the ignorability is potentially what makes this thing just as violent as the sort of other thing. And I would take the sound of those planes as something a bit different. I would say that it's as ignorable as it is lethal, right? So it's really about sort of acting the ways that a lot of those videos you see online that I've posted. You have those two modes of attention being activated at the same time. So you have someone interpolated to take out their phone and film the sky and record what they're hearing above them. But also what you're hearing in the kind of ambient space of that sound is children playing, people having normal conversations, right? So you're hearing at once people listening and not listening, right? You're listening to people ignoring and listening to this thing in the sky. You're listening to the two ways it occupies always at once. And I think that's a really important way to understand the ways that these violences, I think, are being activated. There's these sort of extreme festive moments of their articulation, but there's also all this, the spaces through which those things erupt from.
Thanks. That was a lovely articulation. I have one more kind of point to kind of think through and introduce, but I think we'll first take one of the audience's question, and that's to Brahma. It's by Anandit Sachdev, who's from Jindal Global University. He says, my question is for Professor Brahma. In the light of the recent Ukraine-Russia war, the citizens of Kyiv have organized cleanup raves inviting people to venues to dance, to techno and trance, while cleaning up the post-war landscapes of their city. If we have to compare the two cases, what is the role of electronic music? Do you believe that electronic music begets the co-production of ritualistic performance, even though one implies a sacrificial / communal call and the other for a more social cause? In that case, would you say that electronic music is only important as long as it amplifies sound and noise in the built environment? Would love to know your thoughts about this.
Yes. So thank you, Anandit, for asking this, I would say, brilliant question. So let me just play, if you have time, I can just play a small clip, and it is here. So I think that will give us another range to think about this question that I have been trying to pose here.
Yes, please do. I think we'll just take 10 minutes more for this.
Yeah. Just 1 second, please. Sorry for taking time. Yeah, so I'm just playing this song. Again, this is a DJ music, but again, suggesting something else. Hope it is audible. Can you hear that?
Yes.
काळजावर कोरलं नाव आमच्या भीमा कोरेगा काळजावर कोरलं नाव आमच्या भीमा शूरवीराची ती कहाणी कोरेगावी आहे निशानी मानवंदनेला येती भीमला काळजावर कोरलं कोरेगा
Okay, so the point I was trying to make here is that we also have a lot of alternative music that is coming through DJ music. I have not discussed that part, but what is happening in these kinds of formation is that more corporeal involvement. It is happening the politics is going into at a gutsy level. It is becoming more gutsy kinds of politics that is entering into these kinds of formations, and that you can see when we discuss about Hindutva Pope or this jockey Hindutva, but you also have a lot of Ambedkarite songs that is also using the similar kinds of music, but creating a more assertive kinds of music. The distinction that we can find and the example that you are giving about Ukraine and other parts, maybe we can also give another examples. So those examples. So what is happening, at least in the Hindutva Pope kinds of formation, that you have songs that is very much encoded with the violence, or I will say ritualistic violence in that sense. And that makes one of the major differences. Second, the way it gets performed in a specific context. So it is getting performed in a very festival context, ritual context, and that is creating a certain kinds of ritual efficacy, in which I'm talking about how music becomes, or how this noise becomes certain kinds of sacrificial kinds of produce certain kinds of sacrificial kinds of code. Not necessarily all the DJ music can be subsumed to these kinds of formations, and therefore we need to make this distinction also, because you have different range of the DJ music, and I will say that many times it is producing a lot of subversive kinds of spaces. And therefore, this becomes a very contested sites in which this music is making intervention. And when we are discussing about Hindutva Pope, then of course, it is getting mainstreamed, but in an interesting way, we can also see a lot of alternative formations are also happening. And I would like to answer your question that way. I'm not precisely saying that DJ music only hinting towards one kinds of formation, but DJ music mixed with a certain kinds of religious songs, and in a specific context is creating this special kinds of sacrificial code that I can talk about.
Thanks. Thanks, Brahma. I hope that answers Anandit's question, but just in the interest
I would also like to add that I think...
please do, Lord.
Yeah.
I think it's wrong to assume either kind of, I don't know, the kind of alchemical formation of any sound to have this kind of innate effect, that even potentially why I did this work on those jets is that I even like that sound in some strange twisted way, and certainly there's been times in my life where I've become ecstatic in the face of noise, in different kind of concerts or whatever, in different situations. So I think it's just to be very clear that all these things are possible at once, right? That all these kinds of sounds are able to elicit kind of multiple and contradictory forces and states. And there's nothing innate in the kind of composition of those sounds that do that, or that produce dread or fear, or yeah.
Thanks, Lawrence. I hope that answers Anandit's question. But Anandit, I mean, feel free to kind of get into a conversation with Brahma and Lawrence beyond this panel. You can write, their emails are available online, and you can write to them or be in conversation with them beyond this. Are there any other questions that somebody would like to kind of ask? You can type them, or you can also raise your hand, and I'll be happy to kind of, take those questions. So if somebody kind of poses them, fine enough. But I've kind of second thing that I want to kind of, draw attention to in conversation with both of you. And I want to start with the thing that some of the terms that Lawrence kind of posed, the notion of accumulation and the accumulation of pressure of sound as landscape, but as pressure being put on individuals and society. When one has debates within urban studies around cities and the spatial transformations that cities are undergoing through, draw upon the lens of accumulation and Harvey's work of accumulation by dispossession. And I was just wondering, in both your works, when we introduce the question of difference, like Lawrence introducing the idea of sovereignty, and in the work of Brahma Prakash, invoking the idea of othering, does that change the terms of discussion or debate, in the sense that the last decade, I mean, I have some understanding of some of the debates that have kind of taken place in India during the last decade, particularly vis-a-vis environmental change, and have largely focused around the notion of bourgeois environmentalism, and the fact that in current in the current moment, the fact that policies of disciplining and taming sound in the city, particularly through the notion of health, are also being kind of posed in that light. But what we see in Brahma's work is a very different thing, and what we see on Lawrence's website, when one goes through it in detail, is kind of using a certain policy kind of that has been made to protect health, to kind of control sound, is being used in this case by invoking the realm of sovereignty. So does difference change the terms of debate in engaging with sound and voice?
Shall I go? Yes.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Yes, so just would like to add that interesting point that you are thinking in terms of disposition, and I think that makes the things more relevant, because I don't think we have given enough attention, or maybe some studies has come, I have not paid attention to that studies. But what is happening that you have very specific kinds of noise, sound, and even things are becoming kind of considered noise many times in a kind of urban sphere. Second, that you have a specific disposition of some kinds of sound and music. So for example, now you have think about the soundscape of Delhi, or maybe for another city, and you will say that some of the sounds are becoming very familiar, some of the sounds are becoming very normative, accepted in that modes. But if you have songs or music, or even religious music coming from one particular community, especially if you are thinking about minority, then minority in Delhi are also located in a certain kinds of one side or other side. And if those sounds appears in other side where they are not located, then it appears like a certain kinds of noise. It appears like a certain kinds of certain kinds of discontinuance in that sense, that it is not going with the ecology, it is not going with the kinds of environment that we can talk about. And more, I will say that with this kinds of disposition of the sound, what we are seeing, that what was even normal 20 years back or 10 years back is becoming quite like, exception nowadays. So if you hear even like, very like, kinds of like, basic slogan, or like, even certain kinds of songs, and then it appears like Muslim songs, it appears like a particular songs, but you have like other range of the songs that may not appear like a specific kinds of songs or part of that kinds of othering. And that is becoming too visible. If I can think about Delhi, if I can think about many parts of North India.
Thanks, Brahma. Lawrence, would you like to come in? You're on mute, Lawrence.
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Would you mind just reformulating it?
So I'm just thinking that, when you post the idea of the everyday, and you mentioned 8.5 years, that's the total amount of time in 15 years that the planes have been flying. And I was wondering what happens to the soundscape and everyday life for the other 8.5 years, and how does life get lived in this situation where there's a long drawn kind of a war, but there are moments where there are possibilities for other things to happen in the everyday. So, and what kind of attention in terms of noise and sound might that life draw attention to, and how might one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think it points to something that this and other projects of mine have been struggling with, which is the sort of labeling of sound as ephemeral, giving it this small window of time in which it exists, right? And often what you find in audio culture and discussions of audio culture is it's really one of the first descriptions of sound. It's almost like a sort of essentializing statement. Sound is ephemeral and intangible. Therefore, we have, I don't know, a phenomenological reading, or we have something else, right? And I think some of what my research has been uncovering over the last sort of decade or so is that maybe sound's relationship to time is not so ephemeral at all in the first place. And maybe the continual sort of need to counter that by, let's say, even in this work, to show that, okay, one plane is ephemeral, but 15 years of them is not, right? Or 8.5 years of them is not. Even that somehow misses the point. I think that the relationship of sound to time is its kind of meaning, right? And I think any sort of PTSD study would have the same kind of effect, right? That like a sound can bring you back to a moment, right? It triggers you back to a time, right? And sort of like the ways in which, I suppose it's a much less linear relationship to the way that sound unfolds, but I think each sound has its history, right? And in the case of Lebanon, what's interesting is there will be people who hear those jets and who weren't alive or don't remember the 2006 invasion when they actually struck the ground and they bombed and they showed what they can do, right? There's a generation who then don't remember the last time, right? So each kind of generation has a different sort of relationship to that sound. It means something else, and I think as it unfolds, I think some of those meanings are quite interesting. And also, again, one of the challenges here, yes. So one of the challenges to think through time and the sort of longue durée of a sound, the way it sort of lives with you. And the other one is to think of the way that it's not heard, right? That we don't even hear it anymore. And to try and find a way to catalog that has been much more challenging, and I think just as essential. And of course, as we're speaking about marks, and accumulation, is it not Marx who say that it's first as tragedy, second repetition as farce? No, what's the repetition? And I think there's something of that here, right? That one plane is like terrifying, and we can all imagine that, oh my God, there's a fighter jet in the sky, but it quickly becomes farcical. At 22,000, maybe at 10,000, it becomes tragic again. And then at 15,000, it becomes farcical, but we're talking 22,000. And so I think that sort of playing out over time also, changes and adapts. And then when the explosion happens, suddenly it's no longer a farce, it's very real, it's attack. And then, we can laugh about it and sort of say it's cutting the laundry wires or something like that. So I think these kind of sort of two relations to that kind of those acts of accumulation and time are kind of have been important for the project. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks a lot, Lawrence, for that.
Can I just come in for just I will take 1-2 minutes. If
Yeah.
that's fine. Yeah.
And then we'll draw
I
this.
was thinking, because I work on more kinds of folk culture, regional culture in that sense from North India. And what I observed also that many times with the kinds of regional assertion that you have regionally marked kinds of geography we are talking about. So for example, if you're thinking about Bhojpuri industry, that how Bhojpuri industry is working, and then you will find that how this whole sound culture, music culture is getting oriented towards one direction, and that is becoming more a kinds of mono sound culture, producing mono sound culture around some kinds of themes. Maybe if you're thinking about Bhojpuri music, then it will be around either erotic kinds of songs or more devotional kinds of songs. But again, if you're making a very minimal shift and thinking in terms of Uttarakhand, so what is how this sound culture is shifting in Uttarakhand, and then you will find that almost there is a whole certain kinds of investment to produce a sound culture around nature, around hills. Even the people or community are not staying there. So there is things that is also getting marked around the identity, around the geography, and that is also producing certain kinds of, if I can use the term, mono sound culture of that geography, but not necessarily in everyday practice or in that kinds of community practices that remains the only sound that we can talk about. But yes, this is also the way that geographies are getting mobilized, or use your term, architectures are getting formed.
Thanks for drawing that. With that, we'll just draw this panel to a close. Thank you, Brahma. Thank you, Lawrence, for accepting our invitation and for the provocations that you've made. We will be in touch with you and be in conversation with you on other kinds of opportunities, as and when they arise at the School of Environment and Architecture. Thank you very much. We'll bring up this panel to a close. The next
Thank you
panel
so much.
5:30, and Shundana has also joined in, so we'll just hand it over to the next panel. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the session, and thanks for this invitation.
Thank you. Bye.